I'm Vivian O'Malley, 35, a Navy lieutenant commander who grew up off State Route 47 and built a career on discipline and clean ledgers. For years, I floated deposits, covered bills, and bailed out family, no questions asked. But when a birthday gift wire hit my personal account and my commander saw the reference number, he went still and said, "Security, now." I chose to report it and redraw every line. Ever been used or blindsided by someone you kept afloat? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we dive in, drop where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more grounded stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a small ranch house off State Route 47, where the mailbox leaned and the gravel driveway had more holes than road. I was the oldest of three, which meant I was the one who figured things out first. Mom worked mornings at the diner and afternoons cleaning offices downtown. Dad moved between construction jobs, welding gigs, and long stretches of looking for the right opportunity. The rhythm was simple. When something broke, they called me. When I couldn't fix it, I found someone who could and figured out how to pay for it. By 14, I was the one calling the plumber when the kitchen sink backed up, negotiating payment plans when the electric bill ran late, and filling out FAFSA forms with a flashlight because we'd forgotten to pay that electric bill again. I didn't complain. I liked solving problems. I liked the clean feeling of a task completed, a crisis averted, a family still functioning because someone, me, had handled the details. ROTC in high school gave me structure I'd been craving without knowing it. Clean uniforms, clear expectations, and adults who showed up when they said they would. The Navy recruiter talked about leadership and service, but what hooked me was simpler: a world where competence mattered more than luck, where showing up on time and doing your job right actually got you somewhere. I sent photos home from boot camp, me in dress blues, standing straight, ribbons aligned. Mom texted back a heart emoji and "proud of you, baby." Dad shared it on Facebook with a caption about how he'd taught me everything I knew about discipline. I let that slide. He meant well, even if he'd never been the one setting alarms or checking homework. My first deployment coincided with my siblings moving out. Lisa needed help with an apartment deposit in Austin. Owen got accepted to community college but couldn't cover books and fees. I wired money from ports in Bahrain and Singapore, proud that my steady government paycheck could smooth the rough edges of their transitions. When Lisa's boyfriend turned out to be a drunk and she needed to break a lease, I flew home on emergency leave to help her pack and find a new place. Money wasn't the point, reliability was. I was the jumper cables when their cars wouldn't start, the cosigner when their credit wasn't quite enough, the emergency fund when life hit them sideways. When I made lieutenant, I bought Dad a refurbished F-150 and paid the insurance for a year. He cried in the driveway, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I pretended not to notice, just handed him the keys and said the truck was his to keep running. Holidays became my operation to plan and execute. I booked flights months in advance, brought gifts that hit the right notes, and ignored the small jokes about government money and fancy uniforms. Dad would introduce me to his friends as my daughter, the officer, with a pride that felt both genuine and complicated. I told myself it was just family noise, the kind of teasing that came with territory. At work, expectations were crystal clear. Complete your watch, file your reports, maintain your equipment, take care of your sailors. At home, the expectations were open-ended and expanding. I paid for Mom's dental work when her insurance fell short. I hired an electrician after Dad tried to rewire the ceiling fan and killed power to half the block. When the water heater died during Christmas break, I had a new one installed and covered the emergency service call. Making lieutenant commander felt like crossing a threshold. I sent a photo of the new caller devices to the family group chat. Dad posted it with a long caption about how proud he was, how he'd always known I was destined for leadership, how he'd taught me the value of hard work. I let it slide again. He was trying to connect to my success the only way he knew how. The imbalance wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. 100 small withdrawals from the account of my time, my money, my emotional bandwidth. Every month brought a new request, a new crisis, a new opportunity for me to demonstrate that blood was thicker than budgets. I kept topping up that account because that's what I did. I solved problems. I showed up. I made things work. My current assignment put me in the procurement oversight office, working with vendor compliance and contract reviews. I wasn't in finance, but I lived adjacent to it, reviewing supplier credentials, tracking payment authorizations, making sure the numbers added up and the documentation supported every dollar that moved through our systems. You develop an eye for patterns, for details that don't quite fit, for the smell of something that doesn't add up properly. The bond with my family sat on top of all that professional training. They were my first team, even if they'd never learned the difference between help and dependence. I told myself that one day they'd notice how much I'd been carrying, that they'd insist on taking some of the weight themselves. I told myself that family was supposed to be the place where you could count on people, even if the counting only seemed to go one direction. Looking back, I can see that I was training them just as much as they were training me. Every time I said yes to a request, every time I covered a gap without being asked, every time I solved their problem faster than they could solve it themselves, I was teaching them that Sister the Officer was a resource to be managed rather than a person to be supported. I was teaching them that my uniform came with a credit line and my rank came with an obligation to share the benefits. But families don't issue policy letters or conduct performance reviews. They operate on love and assumption, on patterns established over years and rarely examined. I loved them, so I helped them. They needed help, so they asked me. The system worked until it didn't, until someone else noticed the pattern and decided to use it for something I'd never intended to support. Until my birthday brought a gift that would change everything, delivered with a wire transfer that made my commander's face go white and brought federal agents into our lives like a storm I should have seen coming. I grew up believing that taking care of family was what you did, no questions asked. I was about to learn that some questions should always be asked, especially when the answers involve other people's money and your country's trust. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I'd mentioned the wire to my commander. I was reviewing vendor documentation when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Agent Martinez, NCIS. We need to speak with you about a financial matter. Are you available at 1400 today?" I stared at the message for 30 seconds, my coffee going cold in my hand. The jokes about my government salary had started subtle and gotten sharper over the past year. "Must be nice to have job security," Lisa would say when I couldn't co-sign another loan. "Must be nice to know people," Owen added when I wouldn't introduce him to anyone who might help with his import business ideas. The family group chat would go quiet for a day or two after I declined a request, then resume as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't nothing. I'd started noticing they talked more to Mom's new boyfriend about money than they talked to me about anything else. When I did get looped into their financial conversations, it was for signatures, addresses, or quick favors only you can do. The shift had been gradual enough that I'd told myself it was normal family adjustment to changing circumstances. Mom had met James at the garage where she got her oil changed. He was friendly, helped her negotiate a fair price on new tires, and started showing up at family dinners with flowers and stories about his import-export consulting business. He asked good questions, listened carefully, and seemed genuinely interested in what everyone was doing with their lives. He asked especially detailed questions about my work. "So how does procurement really function in the military?" He'd wondered over Thanksgiving turkey. "I mean, how do you make sure you're getting fair prices from contractors?" I'd kept my answers general and professional. "There are systems in place. Oversight. Competition." He'd nodded thoughtfully and changed the subject, but he kept circling back to themes of compliance, vendor relationships, and how decisions really got made. At Christmas, Dad had suggested I take a look at a bid package his buddy was submitting for a city contract. "Just tell him if it looks right. You know how these things work." I'd explained that I couldn't review civilian contracts, that it would be inappropriate and potentially illegal. Dad had said I was acting bigger than the family, and James had smoothed things over by suggesting they find a civilian consultant instead. Owen had started sending me screenshots of cryptocurrency investments and asking if I could make introductions to anyone who knows about financial security. When I'd said no, He'd replied with a thumbs down emoji and hadn't texted for 3 weeks. Lisa had asked if I could put in a word for her friend who was applying for a government job. I'd explained that I didn't work in hiring, that there were proper channels for applications. She'd said, I thought family helped family. On a video call in February, Mom had mentioned they were structuring a small inheritance from Great Aunt Eleanor. The word caught my attention immediately. Who told you to use that word? I'd asked. Mom had waved dismissively. James said it just means organizing it properly, making it neat for taxes. I'd felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I'd let it pass. The jokes about my access and connections weren't really jokes anymore. They carried an edge, an expectation that my position existed to benefit them. When I'd refused to co-sign a business loan for Owen, Lisa had said, must be nice to have all that government backing and not share it. When I declined to attend a meeting between James and some of his business associates, Dad had asked, what's the point of having a daughter with clearances if she won't even meet people? I'd started setting boundaries, but gently. No business introductions. No contract reviews. No mixing of my professional role with family favors. The response had been a gradual cooling, a sense that I was being selfish with resources that didn't really belong to me alone. We're not asking you to do anything wrong, James had said. We're asking you to care about your family's opportunities. But opportunities for what? That question had been nagging at me for months, along with a growing sense that conversations happened around me that didn't include me. Phone calls that ended when I walked into rooms. References to the thing we discussed, without details. A feeling that my family was becoming something I recognized less and less. The birthday wire had felt like a peace offering at first. Finally, let us help you for once, the memo had read. But the amount was wrong, too large for a family gift, too round for a collection of personal contributions. And the routing information, when I'd looked more carefully, had included details that seemed unnecessarily complex for a simple transfer between family members. When I'd called Mom to ask about the source, she'd said family money but couldn't specify which account. When I'd pressed, she'd handed the phone to James. He'd been cheerful and vague, from a friend's business account. Celebratory payment. You deserve something nice. When I'd said I couldn't accept funds from business accounts tied to his ventures, he'd said, but it's already yours. That's when I'd moved the money to a holding account and documented everything. That's when I'd mentioned it to my commander as a courtesy disclosure. That's when his face had gone white and he'd said, get security now. That's when I'd learned that generosity and manipulation could look exactly the same until trained eyes examined the details. Now Agent Martinez was requesting a meeting, and I was about to discover how much I didn't know about the people I'd been taking care of for so many years. Agent Martinez was younger than I'd expected, with careful eyes and a way of speaking that was both professional and kind. We met in a conference room on base, along with Agent Chen and a woman from Financial Crimes who took notes without looking up. They'd spread printouts across the table, bank records, wire transfers, business registrations, like pieces of a puzzle I was about to help them complete. The reference number on your birthday wire matches a pattern we've been tracking, Agent Martinez explained. Multiple transfers to relatives of cleared personnel, all with similar routing signatures, all designed to look like family gifts or personal loans. She slid a chart across the table. Yours was the 15th we've identified in 6 months. The money had come from an account registered to Meridian Consulting Services, a shell company that existed primarily to receive and redistribute funds from a network of defense contractors already under investigation for inflated invoicing. They're not just stealing, Agent Chen added. They're investing the stolen money in new relationships. Building leverage. I looked at the list of names, other military personnel, civilian contractors, people with access to information or systems that could be valuable to the right buyer. You think my family was recruited? I asked. We think someone recruited your family to recruit you, Agent Martinez said gently. The pattern is always the same. New boyfriend, business associate, family friend with big ideas and loose connections. They identify the family member with access, then they study the family dynamics until they understand how influence flows. James had been studying us, I realized. Learning who made decisions, who needed money, who felt overlooked or underappreciated. Learning that I was the family's financial backstop, the one who could be counted on to help when help was needed. Learning how to make his generosity look like theirs. The birthday gift was a test, Agent Chin explained. If you'd accepted it quietly, kept it, spent it, they would have known they could trust you with larger amounts. If you'd asked questions but ultimately kept quiet, they would have known you could be managed. If you'd reported it, he gestured to the conference room, they would have known to cut their losses and move on. I thought about all the times James had asked questions about procurement processes, vendor relationships, oversight mechanisms. All the times he'd suggested that families should help each other with business opportunities. All the times he'd made my family feel like I was being selfish with access that could benefit everyone. Your family may not have known, Agent Martinez said. In most cases, they don't. They're told they're helping a friend, participating in a celebration, showing love for someone who's always helped them. The emotional manipulation is usually more sophisticated than the financial manipulation. The money trail was elegant in its simplicity. Defense contractors submitted inflated invoices for routine services, cleaning, maintenance, supplies. The overpayments got routed through a series of consulting companies that existed only on paper. The cleaned money emerged as business investments and personal gifts that could be traced back to legitimate companies with legitimate contracts. We estimate they've moved about $8 million this way, Agent Chin said. Most of it goes back to the original conspirators, but they invest maybe 10% in relationship building. Birthday gifts, emergency loans, investment opportunities. They're very patient. I signed a statement detailing every conversation I could remember, every question James had asked, every suggestion he'd made about family business opportunities. I provided screenshots of text messages, copies of bank records, and a timeline of financial requests that stretched back 18 months. You did exactly the right thing, Agent Martinez said as we finished. Most people in your position either keep quiet or try to handle it themselves. Either choice usually makes the problem worse. I asked about my family, about what would happen to them. We'll make contact, Agent Chin said. We'll explain what happened and what they need to do going forward. In most cases, the family members are relieved to understand what was really happening. The emotional manipulation is often harder to recover from than the financial manipulation. That evening, I called my JAG officer for advice on how to handle the aftermath. Document everything, he said. Don't make any financial transactions with family members until this is resolved. Don't discuss your work with anyone outside official channels. Let the investigators handle contact with your family. I sat in my apartment that night, looking at birthday cards that had arrived separately from the wire, real cards with real messages from people who knew me well enough to pick cards that matched my sense of humor. My sister had sent one with a cartoon of a woman in uniform surrounded by mountains of paperwork, captioned, "Happy birthday to someone who makes it look easy." Mom had sent one with a photo of the three of us kids from 10 years ago, with a note inside, "Proud of the woman you've become." Those were real gifts, I realized. They required thought, effort, personal knowledge. They couldn't be forged or manipulated or used as leverage. They were what family generosity actually looked like when it wasn't being manufactured by someone with an agenda. The fake gift had been larger, flashier, more convenient. It had required no knowledge of my preferences, no effort beyond entering numbers into a computer, no relationship beyond understanding that I was someone who could be useful. It was exactly the kind of gift that someone gives when they want something more valuable in return. I thought about all the real help I'd given over the years, all the genuine crises I'd helped resolve, all the authentic love that had motivated my support for my family. That was still real. That still mattered. But it had been surrounded by something else, something that had been growing like a tumor, fed by someone who saw opportunity where I saw obligation. The investigation would continue, but my part was mostly finished. I'd provided the information they needed, answered the questions they'd asked, and begun the process of untangling my financial life from my family's. The rest would be up to agents and attorneys and people whose job it was to follow money through its hiding places until it led them to the people who'd stolen it. I was a witness now, not a victim. That distinction felt important. Witnesses tell the truth and let justice handle the consequences. Victims sometimes make the mistake of trying to fix things that they didn't break in the first place. The new normal started immediately. No financial support to my family pending the investigation's conclusion. No favors that involved my security clearance or my professional connections. No mixing of family relationships with work responsibilities. Everything documented, nothing assumed, clear lines between personal affection and professional integrity. I asked the JAG office to help me draft a notice that the agents could deliver, explaining that all financial interactions were suspended while federal investigators examined the source of recent transactions. It was neutral language. Do not send funds. Do not request funds. Do not discuss my work responsibilities or professional connections. The reaction came fast and emotional. Lisa texted calling me cold and asking how I could turn on family like this. Dad left a voicemail. We didn't know anything was wrong. Can't we just fix this between us? Owen sent a long paragraph about family loyalty and government paranoia. Mom's boyfriend sent nothing at all. I didn't respond to any of them. The standing order was no engagement until the investigation concluded. The consequence was silence that felt like stepping into a clean, quiet room after years of background noise I hadn't realized was there. At work, I filed updated financial disclosures and sat for follow-up interviews. Each question was specific, each answer was factual. When did he first mention import-export? 6 months ago. What exactly did he say about vendor relationships? He asked how we ensure fair pricing from contractors. Did anyone in your family ever ask you to review documents? My father asked me to look at a city bid package last Christmas. The questions helped me understand how much information I'd been sharing without realizing it. Casual conversations about work stress, general comments about bureaucratic processes, complaints about vendor management, all of it had been collected and analyzed and turned into a map of potential vulnerabilities. External pressure came through relatives I hadn't heard from in years. An aunt suggested a family call to work this out. A cousin asked if I really needed to make this a federal case. My grandmother's neighbor somehow got my number and called to say that family was more important than politics. I didn't respond to any of them. The agents had been clear, keep the communication chain tight. My brother tried guilt in a text message. You're not the FBI, you're our sister. I let the message sit unread for 3 days. When I finally looked, there was a second message, much shorter, fine. Whatever. The command climate made all the difference. Nobody treated me like a scandal or a security risk. I was a witness who'd done the right thing, nothing more or less. My supervisors checked in regularly but didn't hover. My colleagues asked if I needed anything but didn't press for details. The Navy took care of its own, especially when its own took care of the Navy. I paused the automatic transfers I'd been making to help with my parents' utilities and insurance. I contacted the companies directly, explained that the payments would stop temporarily, and provided information for transferring the accounts back to my parents' names. It was tedious work, hold music and verification questions and paperwork, but it was necessary. The decision wasn't about punishment. It was about preventing further entanglement while the investigators figured out where the money had really come from and where it was supposed to go. My family would have to meet their own obligations under their own names, which was how it should have been all along. The quiet that followed was the first clean space I'd had with them in years. It didn't feel triumphant or satisfying. It felt like proper record-keeping, like finally organizing files that had been scattered across too many folders for too long. Without my monthly contributions, my parents missed a mortgage payment and had to ask a neighbor for help covering it. They didn't call me. That was progress. The boundary was holding, and they were learning to work within it rather than around it. James disappeared from all family communications within a week of the agent's first contact. Mom mentioned that he'd stopped coming around, that he'd said something about needing to focus on business in another region. She seemed genuinely confused about his departure, which told me she probably hadn't known what he was really doing. Lisa picked up extra shifts at the restaurant and posted on social media about grind mode and doing whatever it takes. She didn't ask me for anything, which was new. I noticed the change but didn't comment on it. She was figuring out how to stand on her own, which was something she needed to do regardless of what had happened with James. Owen tried a legitimate side hustle for the first time in years, warehouse shifts on weekends. In the old system, I would have sent him work boots and a meal card and probably helped with gas money for the commute. This time I left space for him to figure it out himself. He managed fine without my help, which probably surprised him as much as it relieved me. The agents kept me informed about their progress. The wire reference numbers had led them to the shell company, which had led them to the defense contractors, which had led them to a pattern of overbilling that stretched back 3 years. Your birthday gift was a small piece of a much larger investigation, Agent Martinez explained. But it was the piece that helped us understand how the recruitment process worked. I wasn't the only family member who'd been approached. The ring had been methodical about identifying cleared personnel with financial stress or complicated family dynamics. They'd studied social media, tracked spending patterns, and looked for people who might be vulnerable to well-timed generosity or family pressure. The transformation wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was procedural. New policies implemented and enforced, clear documentation of all interactions, separation of family relationships from professional responsibilities. My bank account was mine. My security clearance was mine. My decision-making authority was mine. I told my commander I was ready to deploy if needed. "We'll keep you here where your knowledge and memory can help," he said. It wasn't a punishment assignment, it was recognition that I understood something valuable about how manipulation worked and how to recognize it early. In the absence of my financial contributions, my family developed new habits and new patterns of mutual support. Some of those changes were healthy. They talked to each other more. They pooled resources for emergencies. They learned to negotiate payment plans and seek help from appropriate sources. Some changes were less healthy. There was tension between my parents about money, and Owen was still drawn to get-rich-quick schemes that didn't involve federal investigations. Both kinds of changes were theirs to own and work through. I could love them without being responsible for managing every aspect of their financial lives. I could support them without being their primary source of support. I could be family without being a resource to be managed. The case moved forward without requiring much more from me. Agents used the data trail from my wire along with similar evidence from other families. The ring collapsed where it always was going to collapse, at the connection points between the inflated contracts and the shell companies, where greed had made people sloppy with documentation and where federal auditors eventually noticed patterns that didn't add up. I received a formal letter of appreciation for my cooperation, nothing framed or ceremonial, just a document that went into my personnel file. It was sufficient recognition. The real reward was learning that I could trust my instincts, follow proper procedures, and let the system work the way it was designed to work. On my next performance evaluation, my commander included a line that would follow me through the rest of my career: demonstrated exemplary judgment under complex personal and professional pressure. That kind of recommendation carries weight in ways that awards and ceremonies don't. It tells future supervisors that I can be trusted with difficult situations and sensitive information. My sister was the first family member to reach out after the initial investigations concluded. Her text was simple: "I didn't know what he was doing. I thought it was just a family gift. I'm sorry." I believed she meant it, but I also knew that good intentions weren't the same as good judgment. I suggested coffee at a neutral location, a place downtown, public enough for safety, private enough for conversation. 1 hour limit. No discussion of money or work. We'd see how it went from there. She looked tired when she arrived, but clearer somehow. "We used you," she said without preamble. "Not just with this James thing, but always. We trained ourselves to see you as the solution to every problem instead of figuring out our own solutions." It was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said about our dynamics. I asked what she wanted going forward. "Normal sister relationship," she said. "No money requests, no access requests, no introductions to people you work with. Just sister stuff. Movies and recipes and complaining about mom and dad like regular people." That seemed possible, but trust would require consistency over time. I told her we could start with regular conversation and see how it developed. If she could demonstrate that she wanted a relationship with me rather than with my resources, we could build something healthier than what we'd had before. With my parents, I set a longer timeline for reconciliation. I wrote them a brief letter explaining that I loved them, would not discuss money or work, and wanted to maintain family relationships within clear boundaries. If they wanted to talk about health, weather, recipes, and family news that didn't involve financial planning, I was available. If that felt limited, it was also sustainable. Dad wrote back asking if there was any way to get past this. I replied that we could move forward, but not by going back to the old patterns. The new normal meant they managed their own finances, made their own connections, and asked for my help only with things that didn't involve my professional life or my bank account. Mom's response was shorter and sadder. I just wanted to help you for once. I understood the sentiment, but I also understood that help offered by someone else using stolen money wasn't really help at all. It was manipulation disguised as generosity, and the disguise had been good enough to fool people who wanted to believe in it. The rebuilding process wasn't about forgiveness, which implied that I had something to forgive. It was about establishing new systems that would prevent similar problems in the future. Forgiveness is a one-time event. Functional family relationships require ongoing maintenance and clear operating procedures. If any of them slipped back into old patterns, treating me like a resource rather than a relative, the consequence would be increased distance, not as punishment, but as protection. Some people change when circumstances change. Others change only when the consequences of not changing become uncomfortable enough to motivate different choices. The final chapter of the investigation was quieter than its beginning. Indictments were unsealed for 5 people, including James and 3 defense contractors. The financial recovery process would take years, but the scheme itself was finished. My wire transfer had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled a network that had been growing for 3 years. I continued to send birthday cards to my family, sometimes with gift cards for restaurants or bookstores. I didn't send cash or checks, and I didn't send anything that could be confused with financial support. The gifts were tokens of affection, not solutions to problems. Owen found steady work at a logistics company and stopped pitching cryptocurrency investments. Lisa finished her degree and got promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant. My parents refinanced their mortgage at a lower rate and learned to live within their actual income rather than their income plus my contributions. The family gatherings that happened after the investigation were smaller and more tentative, but they were also more honest. Nobody asked me to solve problems that weren't mine to solve. Nobody treated my presence as an opportunity to gain access to resources or connections. We talked about normal family things, health updates, job changes, whose turn it was to host Christmas. It wasn't the warm, generous family dynamic I'd once imagined we had. But it was real in ways that the previous dynamic had never been. Real affection, real conversation, real relationships that didn't depend on anyone playing roles they couldn't sustain. The lesson wasn't about money, although money had been the tool used to teach it. The lesson was about custody of my name, my position, my choices, my boundaries. Nobody gets to use those things without my explicit consent, no matter how they're related to me or how much I care about them. I still help family members when genuine emergencies arise, but I help them connect with appropriate resources rather than becoming the resource myself. I still care about their well-being, but I don't consider myself responsible for their financial security. I still love them, but I love them from a position of clear boundaries rather than unlimited availability. Justice didn't arrive with sirens and handcuffs, though those came too. It arrived in the form of federal agents who took my reports seriously, a commander who backed my decision to speak up, a system that worked the way it was supposed to work when someone followed proper procedures. It arrived in the form of a family learning to function without using one member as an unlimited resource. The quiet victory was in the clean set of accounts, the clear boundaries, the relationships that were healthier for being more honest about what they were and what they weren't. It was in the knowledge that if anyone ever tried to compromise me again, through family pressure, financial manipulation, or any other method, I would recognize it immediately and know exactly who to call. I keep Agent Martinez's business card in my wallet, not because I expect to need it again, but because it reminds me that there are people whose job it is to investigate these things, and my job is to report them. Clear roles, clear procedures, clear outcomes. That's how systems work when everyone does their part. The final chapter of this story isn't really final, It's ongoing, written in the daily choices I make about trust, boundaries, and responsibility. Every security briefing I give, every young officer I mentor, every family gathering where financial topics stay appropriately separate from professional ones, adds another page to a narrative that began with a birthday wire and evolved into a career dedicated to protecting the institutions that protect all of us. Last month, I was contacted by a Navy lieutenant whose husband had started asking detailed questions about her work in naval intelligence. The questions had progressed from general interest to specific curiosity about overseas deployments, foreign contacts, and classified systems. When he'd suggested she document some of the stuff for a book he was supposedly writing about military families, she'd remembered my presentation from her security training and decided to call. "I feel like I'm betraying him," she told me during our phone conversation. "He's my husband. We're supposed to trust each other completely." I understood the conflict. Marriage is supposed to be about total honesty and shared resources. Military service requires compartmentalization and careful boundaries. Sometimes those requirements feel incompatible. Document the requests, I advised. Ask specific questions about why he needs this information and how he plans to use it. If his answers seem reasonable and his explanations are consistent, you're probably fine. If he gets defensive or tries to pressure you, trust that instinct and report it. 2 weeks later, she called back. Her husband had become angry when she'd started asking follow-up questions about his book project. He'd accused her of not trusting him, of choosing the military over their marriage, of being paranoid and controlling. The emotional manipulation had escalated quickly once she'd started pushing back. "That's when I knew something was wrong," she said. "Someone who really loves you doesn't try to make you feel guilty for following security procedures." She'd reported the situation to her security officer. The investigation revealed that her husband had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service through an online gaming community where he'd met people who'd gradually gained his trust and offered him money for information about his wife's work. The case was still under investigation, but the lieutenant had probably prevented a significant intelligence compromise by recognizing the warning signs and following proper procedures. Her marriage was ending, which was painful, but she was safe and her clearance was intact. Sometimes those are the only good outcomes available. Stories like hers remind me why the work matters. Every family member who understands security requirements, every military member who knows how to recognize manipulation, every investigation that stops a compromise before it happens, makes our institutions stronger and our country safer. The individual decisions add up to collective security. My own family continues to evolve within the boundaries we've established. Owen recently got promoted to a supervisory position at his logistics company and mentioned that some of the skills he learned in our family crisis, documentation, clear communication, asking direct questions about important issues, had helped him in his professional development. He hadn't intended to learn those skills through a federal investigation, but he learned them nonetheless. Lisa is engaged to a teacher she met through friends. When she brought him to meet the family, he asked thoughtful questions about everyone's work, but stayed away from topics that clearly fell outside civilian conversation. He'd been briefed, I realized, about my background and the importance of not asking inappropriate questions. It was a sign of respect for both my position and Lisa's understanding of security requirements. Mom has started volunteering with a financial literacy program at the community center, helping other women understand budgeting, credit, and how to recognize financial fraud. She says the work helps her feel like she's using what she learned from her experience with James to protect other people from similar manipulation. It's a healthy way to process what happened and contribute to something positive. Dad still struggles sometimes with understanding why I can't help with certain family requests, but he's learned to accept that some questions don't get answered and some connections don't get made. When his friend's son applied for a position with a defense contractor, Dad mentioned it to me once and then dropped the subject when I explained that I couldn't provide recommendations or introductions. No argument, no pressure, just acceptance that those boundaries exist for reasons he doesn't need to understand. The house I bought has become a place where colleagues and friends gather for holiday meals, birthday celebrations, and informal mentoring conversations. Young officers come by to ask questions about career decisions, work-life balance, and how to handle family pressure about military benefits and opportunities. I share what I've learned about setting boundaries, following procedures, and maintaining integrity under pressure. These conversations often happen in my kitchen while we're cooking together or on the back deck while we're grilling dinner. The informal setting makes difficult topics easier to discuss. People ask questions they might not ask in an office environment, and I can provide perspective they might not get from official training materials. How do you know when you're being paranoid versus being appropriately cautious? A young lieutenant asked recently. My girlfriend keeps asking about my deployment schedule, and I can't tell if she's worried about me or if there's something else going on. I told her to trust her instincts while also being systematic about evaluation. Document the questions. Notice patterns. Pay attention to whether the person asking seems satisfied with appropriate answers or keeps pushing for more specific information. Most importantly, remember that people who care about you will respect boundaries you set for good reasons. Appropriate caution doesn't feel paranoid, I explained. It feels like following established procedures for established reasons. Paranoia feels like seeing threats everywhere and trusting no one. If you're asking thoughtful questions and following protocols, you're being appropriately cautious. The difference matters. Security requirements shouldn't make us suspicious of everyone around us. They should make us thoughtful about information sharing, careful about documentation, and willing to seek guidance when situations seem unusual. The goal is to maintain healthy relationships while protecting classified information and maintaining institutional trust. The speaking engagements have evolved from reactive presentations about what went wrong to proactive discussions about how to do things right. I talk to new families during orientation programs, explaining security requirements in practical terms that help people understand how to maintain normal relationships while meeting professional obligations. Your family doesn't need to understand classification levels or threat assessments, I tell these audiences. They need to understand that some topics are off limits for good reasons, that security procedures aren't personal rejections, and that you can love them completely while still maintaining professional boundaries. The questions families ask are usually practical. Can they visit the base? Can their children tell friends what their parent does for work? Can they post photos of military ceremonies on social media? Can they ask for help understanding military benefits? The answers are usually straightforward once you explain the reasoning behind the requirements. The more complex questions come from the military members themselves. How do you explain to your spouse that you can't discuss certain aspects of your deployment? How do you handle parents who want to show off your security clearance to their friends? How do you maintain intimacy in a marriage when significant portions of your work life can't be shared? These questions don't have simple answers, but they have workable approaches. You communicate clearly about what can and can't be shared. You emphasize that secrecy about work doesn't mean secrecy about feelings, concerns, or non-classified aspects of your experience. You find ways to maintain emotional intimacy that don't require complete informational transparency. The training programs I help develop now include family components, sessions where spouses and parents learn about security requirements and how to support their military family members in meeting those requirements. These sessions reduce misunderstandings, prevent inadvertent security violations, and help families feel included in their loved one's professional life without being inappropriately involved in classified activities. One of the most effective exercises involves role-playing scenarios where family members practice appropriate responses to questions from friends, neighbors, or new acquaintances. They learn how to show pride in their military family member while avoiding specific details about assignments, travel, or work responsibilities. They practice deflecting inappropriate questions without seeming rude or suspicious. The feedback from these programs consistently emphasizes relief. Families appreciate knowing what's expected of them, what's prohibited, and how to navigate social situations without inadvertently creating problems. Military members appreciate having families who understand the requirements and support them in meeting those requirements rather than pressuring them to make exceptions. The evolution of my career has been shaped by that birthday wire in ways I couldn't have predicted. What began as a personal crisis became professional expertise, and that expertise has become a way to serve that feels meaningful beyond routine military operations. I'm protecting national security by helping individuals make good decisions about personal relationships and professional responsibilities. The awards and commendations matter less than the knowledge that the work makes a difference. Every family that understands security requirements, every military member who reports suspicious activity, every compromise that's prevented because someone recognized warning signs and followed proper procedures, represents a small victory in a larger effort to maintain institutional integrity. The personal cost of learning these lessons was significant: family relationships disrupted, trust violated, financial manipulation discovered and stopped. But the professional benefit has been substantial: expertise developed, career enhanced, contributions made to institutional security that will continue long after I retire from military service. The balance between personal and professional life isn't perfect, but it's sustainable. I have relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. I have work that feels meaningful beyond paycheck and benefits. I have knowledge that helps other people avoid the mistakes I might have made and the crises I actually experienced. The story that began with my family's birthday gift continues with every training session I conduct, every young officer I mentor, every family that learns to navigate military life with appropriate understanding of security requirements. It's a story about individual responsibility, institutional trust, and the ongoing work of protecting the systems that protect all of us. I keep Agent Martinez's business card in my wallet, not because I expect to need it again, but because it reminds me that there are people whose job it is to investigate these things, and my job is to report them. Clear roles, clear procedures, clear outcomes. That's how systems work when everyone does their part. That's how trust is maintained, security is preserved, and institutions continue to serve the purposes for which they were created. The ripple effects of the investigation continued long after the headlines faded. 3 months after the indictments, Agent Martinez called to update me on the broader scope of what they'd uncovered. "Your case opened up an entire network we didn't know existed," she said. 12 more military families, 8 civilian contractors, and about $15 million in fraudulent billing spread across 4 different defense contracts. Each family had a similar story: a new boyfriend, business partner, or family friend who'd asked careful questions and offered generous gifts. Each military member had been selected for specific vulnerabilities: recent divorces, sick parents, children with special needs, siblings with addiction problems. The emotional manipulation had been precise and patient. They studied social media posts going back years, Agent Martinez explained. Birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, family emergencies. They knew who needed money before they approached anyone. They knew which family members had influence and which ones felt overlooked. They built psychological profiles like they were running a counterintelligence operation. I thought about James studying our Thanksgiving dinner conversation, noting who deferred to whom, who looked uncomfortable when money came up, who seemed eager to prove their worth to the family's success story. He'd cataloged our dynamics like a researcher gathering data, then designed his approach to exploit what he'd learned. The defense contractors at the center of the scheme had been methodical about their targeting. They'd identified contracts with minimal oversight, inflated costs by exactly the amount that would stay under audit thresholds, and used the excess funds to build a network of compromised personnel who could provide early warnings about investigations, inside information about upcoming contracts, and access to restricted systems and information. "Your family was probably Plan B," Agent Chen told me during a follow-up interview. "Plan A would have been direct recruitment, offering you money or opportunities directly. But they studied you long enough to know that wouldn't work. So they went through the people you cared about, made it look like family loyalty instead of personal greed." The sophistication bothered me more than the money. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was systematic espionage disguised as family drama. Someone had weaponized my love for my family, turned my sense of responsibility into a vulnerability, and nearly succeeded in making me an unknowing participant in my own compromise. The court proceedings stretched over 18 months. I testified twice, once in a preliminary hearing where I explained the timeline of financial requests and unusual questions, and once during the main trial where I walked the jury through James's gradual escalation from friendly interest to specific intelligence gathering. The defense attorney tried to portray me as paranoid, someone who'd misinterpreted normal family interactions and caused a federal investigation over a misunderstanding. "Isn't it possible," he asked, "that your boyfriend simply wanted to understand your work because he cared about you and your family?" "He wasn't my boyfriend," I said. "He was my mother's boyfriend." And people who care about military families don't ask detailed questions about procurement oversight or suggest ways to circumvent vendor verification procedures. The prosecutor walked me through specific conversations, specific questions James had asked that revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had about defense contracting processes. By the time I finished testifying, the defense attorney looked like he regretted his line of questioning. James was convicted on 8 counts of conspiracy and fraud. He got 6 years in federal prison. The 3 defense contractors got longer sentences, between 8 and 12 years each. The money was harder to recover. Much of it had been moved offshore or spent on assets that had since been sold. But the network was dismantled, the contracts were terminated, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar schemes. I received a commendation letter from the Secretary of the Navy for exceptional vigilance in protecting national security interests. It was formal language for doing what I'd been trained to do, recognize threats and report them through proper channels. But it felt good to be recognized for making the right choice under pressure. The commendation opened doors I hadn't expected. I was invited to speak at security awareness training sessions, sharing my experience with other military personnel who might face similar attempts at compromise. The story was always the same: trust your instincts, document everything, report early, and let investigators handle the investigation. The emotional manipulation is usually more sophisticated than the financial manipulation, I would tell these audiences. They don't want your bank account. They want your access, your knowledge, your position. Money is just the tool they use to create obligation and dependency. Young officers would ask questions after these presentations. How do you know when normal family requests become something more? How do you balance family loyalty with security requirements? How do you explain to relatives why you can't help them with what seem like reasonable requests? The answers weren't complicated, but they required practice. Document unusual requests. Ask specific questions about funding sources. Set clear boundaries about work-related information. Trust the people trained to investigate when something feels wrong. The hard part wasn't knowing what to do, it was being willing to do it when the people you loved were asking you not to. My family's recovery happened slowly and unevenly. Mom struggled the most with what had happened. She genuinely cared about James, had seen him as someone who made her life easier and more interesting. Learning that his attention had been calculated rather than authentic left her questioning her judgment about people in general. "I introduced him to all of you," she said during one of our careful phone conversations. "I brought someone dangerous into our family because I was lonely and he seemed nice." The guilt was harder for her to process than the anger. I tried to explain that smart, caring people get manipulated precisely because they're smart and caring. He was a professional, I told her. This was his job. You weren't supposed to be able to see through it. But guilt doesn't respond to logic, and Mom carried the weight of feeling responsible for putting her children at risk. Dad's reaction was more straightforward anger. He felt used and embarrassed, angry at James for the deception and angry at himself for falling for it. "I should have known," he said. "I should have asked more questions about his business, about where his money came from." But Dad had wanted to believe that someone successful was interested in his family, proud of his daughter's achievements, willing to share opportunities. Lisa bounced back fastest, partly because she'd had the least direct contact with James and partly because she was already in the process of building a more independent life. The experience had taught her things about family dynamics that she might not have learned otherwise. "We were all using you," she said during one of our coffee meetings 6 months after the trial ended. "Not like James was using us, but still. We got comfortable letting you solve problems we should have solved ourselves." She'd started asking for advice instead of money, suggestions instead of solutions. It was a healthier dynamic for both of us. Owen took longer to adjust, partly because he'd been most invested in the idea that knowing the right people was the key to financial success. Learning that his sister's connections weren't available to him meant he had to develop his own skills, his own network, his own strategies for advancement. He eventually found steady work with a shipping company and started taking business courses at the community college. When he graduated with a certificate in logistics management, I sent a congratulations card and a gift card for dinner. It felt good to celebrate an achievement that was entirely his own. The investigation had broader effects on military security protocols. New training programs were developed to help personnel recognize social engineering attempts. Family members were included in some security briefings, educated about the warning signs of recruitment attempts and the importance of reporting suspicious approaches. Your case became a teaching tool, Agent Martinez told me a year after the trial. We use it to train new agents, to brief military security officers, to educate families about how these schemes work. You probably prevented dozens of similar compromises just by speaking up when you did. The work felt meaningful in a way that routine operations sometimes didn't. I'd helped protect not just my own security clearance, but the security of systems and information that other people depended on. I demonstrated that the training worked, that the procedures were effective, that individuals could make a difference by following protocol rather than trying to handle problems alone. My career trajectory changed in subtle but significant ways. I was selected for advanced security training, recommended for assignments that required both technical expertise and strong judgment under pressure. The commendation letter became part of a pattern of recognition that suggested I could be trusted with increasing responsibility. When I made full commander 2 years later, the promotion felt earned rather than automatic. My fitness reports consistently mentioned sound judgment, exceptional integrity, and commitment to institutional values. These weren't empty phrases, they reflected specific choices I'd made under specific pressures, times when I'd chosen institutional loyalty over personal convenience. The family relationships that survived were stronger for having been tested. The ones that didn't survive probably weren't as solid as I'd believed. My parents and I found a sustainable balance between affection and independence. My siblings and I developed adult relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. There were still family gatherings, but they were smaller and more intentional. Conversations focused on personal news, shared interests, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. Money rarely came up, and when it did, it was in the context of people sharing information rather than seeking solutions. I bought a house near the base 2 years after the investigation ended. It was a small place with a good kitchen and a workshop in the garage where I could restore furniture and work on projects that had nothing to do with national security or family dynamics. I invited people over for dinner, colleagues, neighbors, friends from the gym. I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. The house had a security system, not because I expected trouble, but because I'd learned to take reasonable precautions seriously. I reviewed my financial statements carefully every month. I documented unusual contacts or requests. I maintained the habits that had protected me once and would protect me again if necessary. Dating was complicated for a while. How do you explain to someone that your last relationship ended when federal agents arrested your mother's boyfriend? How do you discuss family dynamics when those dynamics had been used as part of a criminal conspiracy? I eventually met someone through work, a civilian contractor who understood security requirements and didn't ask inappropriate questions about classified information. He had his own complicated family, his own stories about learning to set boundaries with people he loved. We understood each other's caution about mixing personal relationships with professional responsibilities. The relationship developed slowly, with clear communication about expectations and boundaries. He met my family after we'd been dating for 6 months, at a barbecue where the conversation stayed safely focused on sports, movies, and his work restoring classic cars. Mom liked him because he listened well and asked thoughtful questions about things that weren't classified. Dad liked him because he knew about engines and didn't mind helping with repair projects. Lisa asked me privately if I'd told him about what happened with James. I said I had, in general terms, as part of explaining why I was careful about certain topics. Good, she said. He should know that we learned from it. The annual security clearance renewal process became routine rather than stressful. I had clean financial records, documented family relationships, and a track record of reporting suspicious activity appropriately. My investigators knew my story, knew I could be trusted to follow procedures, knew I would continue to prioritize institutional security over personal convenience. 5 years after the investigation, I was selected for a position that required top-secret clearance and specialized training in counterintelligence. The assignment meant briefing new personnel on security threats, developing training materials, and serving as a resource for people facing the kind of pressures I'd experienced. The work was satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. I could help other people recognize manipulation attempts before they became compromised situations. I could explain how emotional pressure tactics worked, how to document suspicious activity, how to navigate family relationships while maintaining security requirements. The stories people shared in these briefings were variations on familiar themes. New romantic partners who asked detailed questions about work. Family members who needed help with business ventures that required introductions to military personnel. Friends who offered investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Each story followed a similar pattern: gradual escalation, emotional manipulation, appeals to loyalty or family obligation, and pressure to bend rules, just this once, for someone you cared about. The specific details varied, but the underlying structure was consistent enough to be recognizable once you knew what to look for. Trust your instincts, I would tell these audiences. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone is pressuring you to make exceptions to security procedures, they probably have reasons for that pressure that aren't in your best interest. Document everything, report early, and let the professionals handle the investigation. The questions after these presentations often focused on family relationships. How do you maintain closeness with people while setting clear boundaries? How do you explain security requirements to relatives who don't understand why they matter? How do you balance personal loyalty with institutional responsibility? The answers weren't always comfortable, but they were consistent. You explain once, clearly, and completely. You set boundaries and maintain them without negotiation. You separate personal affection from professional access. You accept that some people might not understand your choices, and you make those choices anyway because they're the right choices to make. My own family had become a case study in successful boundary management. We maintained regular contact, celebrated important events together, and supported each other through personal challenges. But we did all of that within clear limits about financial entanglement and professional access. When Owen got engaged, I helped with the wedding planning, but not the wedding financing. When Lisa bought her first house, I celebrated with her but didn't co-sign the mortgage. When Dad needed surgery, I took leave to help with his recovery, but arranged for professional home health services rather than managing his care myself. The relationships were healthier for having clear parameters. Nobody wondered whether I would help with a crisis. I would, within appropriate limits. Nobody wondered whether they could count on me for support. They could, in ways that were sustainable for everyone involved. Nobody wondered whether my affection was conditional on their financial independence. It wasn't, but my financial support was conditional on genuine emergency rather than routine convenience. 10 years after the investigation, I was invited to speak at a conference on insider threat prevention. The audience included security professionals from multiple agencies, military personnel from all branches, and civilian contractors working on classified projects. My presentation focused on the importance of individual responsibility in maintaining institutional security. Every security clearance represents trust, I told the audience. Not just trust in your ability to keep secrets, but trust in your judgment about who deserves access to those secrets and under what circumstances. That trust is earned through daily choices to prioritize institutional security over personal convenience. The case study I presented was my own, though I didn't identify myself as the subject. I walked through the progression from normal family financial support to unusual requests to suspicious gift-giving to federal investigation. I emphasized the importance of documentation, early reporting, and allowing trained investigators to determine whether concerns were justified. The subject in this case could have handled the situation differently, I explained. She could have kept the money and hoped nothing would come of it. She could have returned the money quietly and tried to manage the family pressure herself. She could have convinced herself that she was overreacting to what might have been innocent generosity. Instead, she'd followed protocol. She documented the transaction, reported it to her supervisor, and cooperated fully with the investigation. The result was the dismantling of a criminal network that had been operating for years and the prevention of further compromises of classified information. Individual vigilance is the foundation of institutional security, I concluded. Systems and procedures only work when individuals choose to use them, especially when using them is difficult or uncomfortable. The questions after the presentation were sophisticated and specific. How do you distinguish between normal family requests and potential compromise attempts? How do you maintain morale when security requirements seem to interfere with personal relationships? How do you train people to recognize emotional manipulation when they're emotionally invested in the relationship? These were the questions I'd been thinking about for a decade, questions that had shaped my understanding of the balance between personal life and professional responsibility. The answers weren't always simple, but they were grounded in experience and proven effective through practice. The lesson I'd learned wasn't that family relationships were dangerous or that military personnel should isolate themselves from civilian connections. The lesson was that clear boundaries made healthy relationships possible, that transparency about security requirements prevented misunderstandings, and that professional obligations could coexist with personal affection when both were managed thoughtfully. My current assignment involves developing training materials for new security clearance holders, people who are learning to navigate the intersection of personal relationships and professional responsibilities for the first time. I help them understand that security requirements aren't punitive measures designed to isolate them from normal human connections. They're protective measures designed to prevent those connections from being weaponized against them. The work feels like completing a circle. I started as someone who needed to learn these lessons through difficult experience. Now I'm someone who can help others learn them through education and preparation, rather than crisis and investigation. The knowledge I gained through my family's betrayal has become a tool for protecting other families from similar manipulation. Agent Martinez and I stay in touch occasionally. She sends updates about cases where my testimony or training materials have been helpful. She tells me about new techniques investigators are seeing, new ways that criminal organizations are trying to compromise cleared personnel, new training programs being developed to counter emerging threats. Your case is still paying dividends, she told me recently. Every time we brief a new agent on social engineering techniques, every time we train military personnel on family security issues, every time we prevent a compromise because someone recognized the warning signs, you're part of that success. The validation feels good, but what feels better is the knowledge that I made the right choice under pressure, and that the choice continues to have positive effects years later. I chose institutional loyalty over family convenience. I chose transparency over secrecy. I chose professional procedures over personal management. Each choice was difficult at the time, but each choice has proven correct with the passage of time. The birthday wire that started everything is still in a federal evidence locker somewhere, probably tagged and filed with thousands of other pieces of evidence from thousands of other cases. But the lessons it taught me have become part of who I am, part of how I think about relationships and responsibility and the weight of trust that comes with wearing the uniform. I keep Agent Martinez's business card in my wallet, not because I expect to need it again, but because it reminds me that there are people whose job it is to investigate these things, and my job is to report them. Clear roles, clear procedures, clear outcomes. That's how systems work when everyone does their part. That's how a birthday gift became a security case and why I drew a hard line. If this resonated, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Your turn. What red flags would have tipped you off sooner? Have you ever had to change money boundaries with family? How did it go? Would you have reported the wire immediately or tried to handle it privately? Drop your take and where you're watching from in the comments. Stay safe, stay documented.